Hi there, you guys. Hope you're doing all right today. Hope you're feeling good. Hoping you're making the best of the time. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite quotes, and then we're going to go back to Tuesdays with Morrie. So one of my favorite quotes is from one of my favorite books called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. You've probably heard of it. If you're in my 10th grade class, it's possible that you read it for summer reading last year. But it's the story, it's a memoir, so it's a true story. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist, and he was taken by the Nazis and taken to Auschwitz and lived there and survived. And this is the memoir of what happened to him. But not only did it happen to him as a prisoner and a human, but as a psychiatrist. So he was able to, in hindsight, kind of look back on a lot that happened there and kind of analyze it through the eyes of a psychiatrist. So if you've never read this book, I really recommend it. It's just one of the great works of humanity, I feel like. But I want to take you right to my favorite quote from it. And let me get myself out of here. So this is at one point in the book. This is a good way in when he's been describing a lot of the sufferings that happened in the camps and things that he witnessed and all kinds of death and all kinds of injustice. And he gets to this page where he's asking a question about, are people completely controlled by their circumstances, or do they still have choices no matter what their circumstances are? And so keep in mind, he's asking this from a place of the absolute worst case scenario, right? He's been in Auschwitz and they're starving, they're mistreated, everyone around him is dying, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is happening. And he kind of at this point is asking this question of, are we controlled by our surroundings, or do we have some manner of control over our lives somewhere deep within us, no matter what? And so he kind of says over here, right here, he says, I may give the impression that the human being is completely and unavoidably influenced by his surroundings. And then he asks these questions, but what about human liberty? Is that theory true, which would have us believe that man is no more than a product of many conditional and environmental factors? Is man but an accidental product of these, right? So he asks these, and then he says this in the bottom paragraph: we can answer these questions from experience as well as on principle. The experiences of camp life show that man does have a choice of action. There were enough examples, often of a heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And that right there is my favorite quote right there. So this idea of we can choose our attitude no matter what. And the reason that I believe that is because he's saying it and he's in a concentration camp. So that's definitely the worst case scenario. And if someone in that situation can say it, then the rest of us can definitely say it in our own lives. He said, they may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So at any moment, in any circumstance, Frankl says, we have the ability to choose our attitudes. And that's just profound. That's just a profound truth. The next paragraph, he goes on a little bit more and he says, and there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity to become molded into the form of the typical inmate. So again, just this idea of no matter what, even in the worst case scenario, you have the ability to choose your own attitude, and that is your last human freedom, the one thing that can never be taken from you. So I'll start just with that thought. And I think we're seeing that in Tuesdays with Morrie. I think we're seeing Morrie act in that exact way as everything else kind of disappears from his life, his mobility and everything else. We still see him preserving his attitude and being in control of how he wants to feel. And he even talked about that in the book with his ideas about detachment and so on. So we'll switch over, but if you've never read Man's Search for Meaning, I really recommend it. It's short, it's not that long, but it's a powerful, powerful read. Okay, so back to Morrie. So here's where we left off yesterday. We've been reading this for probably about 10 or 11 days now, so feel free to go back. But in the meantime, we're going to pick up right where we left off. In the South American rainforest, there is a tribe called the Dasana, who see the world as a fixed quantity of energy that flows between all creatures. Every birth must therefore engender a death, and every death bring forth another birth. This way, the energy of the world remains complete. When they hunt for food, the Dasana know that the animals they kill will leave a hole in the spiritual well. But that hole will be filled, they believe, by the souls of the Dasana hunters when they die. Were there no men dying, there would be no birds or fish being born. I like this idea. Morrie likes it too. The closer he gets to goodbye, the more he seems to feel we are all creatures in the same forest. What we take, we must replenish. It's only fair, he says. The 10th Tuesday, we talk about marriage. I brought a visitor to meet Morrie, my wife. He had been asking me since the first day I came, when do I meet Janine? When are you bringing her? I'd always had excuses until a few days earlier when I called his house to see how he was doing. It took a while for Morrie to get to the receiver, and when he did, I could hear the fumbling as someone held it to his ear. He could no longer lift a phone by himself. "Hi," he gasped. "You doing okay, Coach?" I heard him exhale. "Mitch, your coach isn't having such a great day." His sleeping time was getting worse. He needed oxygen almost nightly now, and his coughing spells had become frightening. One cough could last an hour, and he never knew if he'd be able to stop. He always said he would die when the disease got his lungs. I shuddered when I thought how close death was. "I'll see you on Tuesday," I said. "You'll have a better day then." "Mitch." "Yeah?" "Is your wife there with you?" She was sitting next to me. "Put her on. I want to hear her voice." Now, I am married to a woman blessed with far more intuitive kindness than I. Although she had never met Morrie, she took the phone. I would have shaken my head and whispered, "I'm not here, I'm not here." And in a minute, she was connecting with my old professor as if they'd known each other since college. I sensed this, even though all I heard on my end was, "Uh-huh, Mitch told me. Oh, thank you." When she hung up, she said, "I'm coming next trip." And that was that. Now we sat in his office, surrounding him in his recliner. Morrie, by his own admission, was a harmless flirt, and while he often had to stop for coughing or to use the commode, he seemed to find new reserves of energy with Janine in the room. He looked at photos from our wedding, which Janine had brought along. "You are from Detroit?" Morrie said. "Yes," Janine said. "I taught in Detroit for 1 year in the late 40s. I remember a funny story about that." He stopped to blow his nose. When he fumbled with the tissue, I held it in place and he blew weakly into it. I squeezed it lightly against his nostrils, then pulled it off like a mother does to a child in a car seat. "Thank you, Mitch." He looked at Janine. "My helper, this one is." Janine smiled. Anyhow, my story. There were a bunch of sociologists at the university, and we used to play poker with other staff members, including this guy who was a surgeon. One night after the game, he said, "Morrie, I want to come see you work." I said, "Fine." So he came to one of my classes and watched me teach. After the class was over, he said, "All right, now, how would you like to see me work? I have an operation tonight." I wanted to return the favor, so I said okay. He took me up to the hospital. He said, "Scrub down, put on a mask, and get into a gown." And the next thing I knew, I was right next to him at the operating table. There was this woman, the patient, on the table, naked from the waist down. And he took a knife and went zip, just like that. Well, Morrie lifted a finger and spun it around. I started to go like this. I'm about to faint. All the blood. Yuck. The nurse next to me said, "What's the matter, doctor?" And I said, "I'm no damn doctor. Get me out of here." We laughed, and Morrie laughed too, as hard as he could with his limited breathing. It was the first time in weeks that I could recall him telling a story like this. How strange, I thought, that he nearly fainted once from watching someone else's illness, and now he was so able to endure his own. Connie knocked on the door and said that Morrie's lunch was ready. It was not the carrot soup and vegetable cakes and Greek pasta I had brought that morning from Bread and Circus. Although I tried to buy the softest foods now, they were still beyond Morrie's limited strength to chew and swallow. He was eating mostly liquid supplements, with perhaps a bran muffin tossed in until it was mushy and easily digested. Charlotte would puree almost everything in a blender now. He was taking food through a straw. I still shopped every week and walked in with bags to show him, but it was more for the look on his face than anything else. When I opened the refrigerator, I would see an overflow of containers. I guess I was hoping that one day we would go back to eating a real lunch together and I could watch the sloppy way in which he talked while chewing, the food spilling happily out of his mouth. This was a foolish hope. "So, Janine," Morrie said. She smiled. "You are lovely. Give me your hand." She did. "Mitch says that you're a professional singer." "Yes," Janine said. "He says you're great." "Oh," she laughed. "No, he just says that." Morrie raised his eyebrows. "Will you sing something for me?" Now, I have heard people ask this of Janine for almost as long as I have known her. When people find out you sing for a living, they always say, "Sing something for us." Shy about her talent and a perfectionist about conditions, Janine never did. She would politely decline, which is what I expected now. Which is when she began to sing. The very thought of you, and I forget to do the little ordinary things that everyone ought to do. It was a 1930s standard written by Ray Noble, and Janine sang it sweetly, looking straight at Morrie. I was amazed once again at his ability to draw emotion from people who otherwise kept it locked away. Morrie closed his eyes to absorb the notes. As my wife's loving voice filled the room, a crescent smile appeared on his face. And while his body was stiff as a sandbag, you could almost see him dancing inside it. I see your face in every flower, your eyes in stars above. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love. When she finished, Morrie opened his eyes and tears rolled down his cheeks. In all the years I have listened to my wife sing, I never heard her the way he did at that moment. Marriage. Almost everyone I knew had a problem with it. Some had problems getting into it. Some had problems getting out. My generation seemed to struggle with the commitment, as if it were an alligator from some murky swamp. I had gotten used to attending weddings, congratulating the couple, and feeling only mild surprise when I saw the groom a few years later sitting in a restaurant with a younger woman whom he introduced as a friend. "You know, I'm separated from so-and-so," he would say. "Why do we have such problems?" I asked Morrie about this. Having waited 7 years before I proposed to Janine, I wondered if people my age were being more careful than those who came before us, or simply more selfish. "Well, I feel sorry for your generation," Morrie said. "In this culture, it's so important to find a loving relationship with someone because so much of the culture does not give you that. But the poor kids today, either they're too selfish to take part in a real loving relationship, or they rush into marriage and then 6 months later they get divorced. They don't know what they want in a partner. They don't know who they are themselves. So how can they know who they're marrying?" He sighed. Morrie had counseled so many unhappy lovers in his years as a professor. It's sad, because a loved one is so important. You realize that, especially when you're in a time like I am, when you're not doing so well. Friends are great, but friends are not going to be here on a night when you're coughing and can't sleep and someone has to sit up all night with you, comfort you, try to be helpful. Charlotte and Morrie, who met as students, had been married 44 years. I watched them together now when she would remind him of his medication, or come in and stroke his neck, or talk about one of their sons. They worked as a team, often needing no more than a silent glance to understand what the other was thinking. Charlotte was a private person, different from Morrie, but I knew how much he respected her, because sometimes when we spoke, he would say, "Charlotte might be uncomfortable with me revealing that," and he would end the conversation. It was the only time Morrie held anything back. "I've learned this much about marriage," he said now. "You get tested. You find out who you are, who the other person is, and how you accommodate or don't." "Is there some kind of rule to know if a marriage is going to work?" Morrie smiled. "Things are not that simple, Mitch." "I know." "Still," he said, "there are a few rules I know to be true about love and marriage. If you don't respect the other person, you're going to have a lot of trouble. If you don't know how to compromise, you're going to have a lot of trouble. If you can't talk openly about what goes on between you, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And if you don't have a common set of values in life, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Your values must be alike. And the biggest one of those values, Mitch, yes, your belief in the importance of your marriage. He sniffed, then closed his eyes for a moment. Personally, he sighed, his eyes still closed. I think marriage is a very important thing to do, and you're missing a hell of a lot if you don't try it. He ended the subject by quoting the poem he believed in like a prayer. Love each other or perish. All right, you guys, that's a good place to stop for today. So have a good rest of the day. Think about all these thoughts. Make the best of everything. Take care of yourself and be well. Stay safe. We'll see you tomorrow.